A Kentucky ghost town caught in the crossfire.
In some cases, people were literally killed in these fights. There was always conflict.
In Japan, a once opulent retreat reclaimed by nature.
The decoration here is fantastic. This place must have been absolutely amazing.
A mountaintop ruin in Italy with a harmful legacy.
What they left behind wasn't just documents, machinery, and equipment. It was an ecological nightmare.
And in Scotland, fragments of a bridge foundation, all that remains of a terrifying disaster.
This just shook up the whole of the UK.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. The remote backwoods of Harlan County, Kentucky, hide the remnants of a grand-looking town.
This was a confident town, a proud town. There's buildings here made of beautiful stone. These are buildings made nicer than they needed to be.
People wanted to get here. There was something there that was drawing them.
Scattered ruins point to an industrial purpose.
One of the more impressive derelict sites is this big house with a huge chimney.
It's hard to know what it is exactly, just looming over these abandoned railroad tracks.
The operation is even more extensive below the surface.
You can see these tunnel entrances. They look like New York's Lincoln Tunnel or Holland Tunnel.
Among these relics lie signs of catastrophe. So what spelt the end for this once imposing town? This deserted settlement of 1,000 homes is Lynch, Kentucky. It dates back to the early 20th century. With its wide streets and fine municipal buildings, Lynch was once one of the richest towns in the state. Michael Obradovich worked here.
This town was so big and so impressive that people were coming from Chicago and New York. It was impressive.
Constructed in 1917, this was the town's department store.
We who lived here call this the big store. All of this here in the front was women's apparel or men's apparel. Over on this side, there was a diner in my time, soda shop. On the far end over there was sporting goods and home goods.
Within 8 years, a large town had been built around it, powered by an enormous state-of-the-art generating station. Its owners spared no expense building this grand place in the middle of nowhere.
U.S. Steel bought up hundreds of acres under Black Mountain in this part of Kentucky. In 1917, the demand for steel was skyrocketing. You had all the armaments that were being used in the war. Everything was made of steel. Ships were being built, rail cars were being built.
Even though there's no iron ore nearby, U.S. Steel invested millions of dollars into these Kentucky backwoods.
The real thing that made Lynch was actually underneath the town, and that was black gold, coal.
Lynch was created for one reason, and that was to provide a reliable and massive supply of coal to the country's leading steel producer, U.S. Steel.
This part of the Appalachian Mountains is very, very rich in carboniferous coal. This is a famous coal deposit that stretches all along North America, and it's been mined for many, many years. The thing that makes the coal at Lynch so special is it's low in sulfur, so it's very good for making steel. These turned out to be some of the wealthiest coal mines in the country.
As the son of a miner, Nick Sturgill knows the hazards that lie below ground here. This is Portal 31, once part of the largest coal complex in the world.
Portal 31, even by today's standards, is enormous. The north heading of Portal 31 goes approximately 13 miles. The east heading actually goes into Virginia just a little ways.
Back in the 1930s, extraction continued apace, despite the risks.
No matter how well a mine is run, it's still very dangerous and difficult work. The coal company also wanted to showcase, to show off their high standards. They also stressed safety a lot.
They even named this place after the father of mine safety, Thomas Lynch.
They wanted to counteract this image that mining was this terrible, dangerous occupation where people were exploited.
It worked. Lynch attracted workers from all over the world. With a German mother and Montenegrin father, former mine manager Michael Obradovich's own family is typical of those who flocked here.
In its heyday, Lynch had around 10,000 people with all those different nationalities. Most of the families here had 5, 6, 7, 8 kids.
The schools, churches, and hotels of Lynch accommodated them well. But the relentless objective here was to dig coal.
They engineered the town to move the coal as efficiently as possible. They built a structure called a tipple. This is like a giant bin that holds coal and then loads it onto rail cars. They built the biggest tipple in the world.
This tipple could handle 15,000 tons of coal a day. Lynch was actually world famous. It held the record when miners produced nearly 13,000 tons of coal in one single 9-hour shift. Now that's pretty impressive statistics.
But the miners were dissatisfied with the low wages and the risks.
Coal dust is so fine, so volatile, that it can combust with any little spark. It can catch on fire, cause an explosion. And at one point in the history of this building, they actually stopped using it because there was so much dust being created and some spontaneous combustion with that dust that created some issues.
Working inside the mine was even more dangerous.
The leading cause of death here at Portal 31 was by roof falls, and believe it or not, a lot of coal car accidents of men being run over or pinned against the rib by a coal cart. The air will kill you. Miners could contract black lung. There's a lot of different ways that a man or woman can perish in a mine.
The owners of Lynch refused to compromise the efficiency of their production. No amount of grandiose town planning could make up for the dangers and low wages of mining. The miners were gearing up for a fight.
There was always conflict between miners and owners, and the owners often responded to that conflict with overwhelming force.
Skirmishes broke out across Harlan County.
This is where battles between the coal companies and the miners came to a head. We had these clashes between miners fighting for more rights and owners trying to keep up production and keep wages low.
In Lynch, rumor has it that the violence didn't end there. One eyewitness told Nick Sturgill what she believes she saw back in the 1930s.
She would be sitting out on the porch, and company officials would walk or ride up Black Mountain with known union members or union sympathizers, what have you. And after a few minutes, she would hear gunshots. And a few minutes later, the company officials would come down the mountain and they would come alone.
No one knows for sure what happened in those troubled times, but the mine owners eventually quashed the discord. And the enormous underground complex at Lynch continued to produce coal for many more years.
Total mileage of tunnels in this mine, if I had to guess, would be upwards or exceed 1,000 miles. During the height of U.S. Steel's operations here at Portal 31, on any given day, you would have approximately 1,500 men on one shift.
But this boom time couldn't last forever. The last piece of coal left the colossal Portal 31 in 1963, and the other mines in Lynch closed during the following decades.
U.S. Steel pulled out of here simply because they pretty much mined out what they could mine easily and economically, but also because, you know, this coal was needed for steel. Well, you know, in the last few decades, steel is really not in demand like it used to be during World Wars or during the Industrial Revolution or the building of skyscrapers or anything like that. So this grade of coal is just not sought after as it once was.
By the late 80s, the economics were changing and the mines eventually shut down.
In those 46 and a half years, U.S. Steel, they mined approximately 120 million tons of coal here.
Today, this ghost town echoes with the memories of the industrious residents who mined its land.
A lot of people tend to forget the blood, sweat, and tears, the struggle that these men put up with every single day to bring this rock out of the ground.
In the city of Kobe in Japan, buildings stand tightly packed together, but one empty structure looms above the rest.
Right at the edge of the city, suddenly the buildings stop and this hill just climbs up away from you.
It's heavily wooded with very, very dense foliage, and so it's really extraordinary to find in the middle of it this striking, decrepit building.
It's like something out of a sci-fi movie where it's half man-made and half just taken over by nature.
The only way to reach it is to step on board the old funicular railway.
Above here, there's a structure that's about 90 years old. The building sits on top of a very high precipice, with an incredible view over the whole of Kobe City.
The unrivaled position the site holds was matched only by its elaborate interiors.
The decoration here is fantastic. In so many brilliant details. And you can tell in its time, this place must have been absolutely amazing. But now it is falling to pieces.
The building has suffered with all sorts of events over the years.
It really looks like it's been through wars or hell, but the question is, what ended this place?
From the top of the railway on Maya Mountain, a solitary path leads towards the old abandoned structure. Utsumi Kenichi works for the heritage group now in charge of the building.
Originally, Maya Mountain was a religious site. Then a large temple called Tenjoji Temple was built here, and it needed a funicular to bring all the materials up. After that, many visitors used the funicular to come up to worship. So this structure was built to welcome them when they arrived.
The original Art Deco features point to the early ambition of this place, which opened in 1929.
In Japan at that time, Art Deco was seen as futuristic. It was the latest cultural import from the West. And this building reflects that fashionable trend.
There's a lot of enthusiasm about the future, and a lot of the design aesthetic really reflects that machine age perspective. You see it in New York, in Paris, in London, with these beautiful lines, trying to imitate the same clean lines of a locomotive or an airplane. That style, you see it all over Japan, and that enthusiasm is expressed in this building as well.
Over there, around the stage, it's designed with curves. That's the style. If I had been alive at the time, I would have loved to have seen it in all its glory.
This vision of modernity was the Maya Club. Boasting public baths, a restaurant, and a theatre, this was a destination in its own right.
This is the screening room. It used to be a cinema where they showed films every day. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and there was a red carpet on the floor. This was a place where people in Kobe came to enjoy themselves. Those people who visited weren't rich or anything. This place was for everyone.
It was built on the promise of a prosperous future, but the rumble of war, which could be heard in the distance, began to threaten the hilltop haven.
Those rooms that had been packed, the grand dining hall, the entertainment room, once filled with people, slowly began to quieten and empty out.
During the early decades of the 20th century, Japan had been pursuing a policy of imperial expansion. They entered the Second World War after attacking the US in December 1941. But Japan's mainland cities were in the direct line of fire when the US fought back, most infamously in 1945.
The skies above Kobe were filled with US bombers. Tons of explosives were dropped on the city.
So in the last few months of the war, the city is devastated.
Almost 9,000 people and 3 square miles of Kobe were obliterated. The destruction went right to the foot of Maya Mountain. The club itself escaped the worst of the carnage, and amid the devastating aftermath of war, it would soon prove invaluable.
So, this was the guest room floor for the original facility. But after the war, soldiers who came back from overseas and those people who lost their homes in Kobe began living here in these rooms.
So the site is turned into a kind of barracks, and they can use this as a base from which they search for their lost family members amidst the devastation of what used to be Kobe.
Their task, their terrible task, was to try to find in all of the rubble their families and their lives and to try and put those back together.
After somehow making it through to the other side of the war years, for this building, there was hope for a brighter future.
Yes, it was damaged and derelict, but actually, throwing a little bit of money at it, it could be brought back to its glory days, but with a slight twist, as a hotel.
The whole site's been restored to its former glory. It's vibrant, it's luxurious, and people can once again enjoy these magnificent views of the city.
But as the damage writ large across the building shows, this story had no fairy tale ending.
Just when it looked as its future was assured, disaster struck again.
The year was 1967. The storm was Typhoon Billy.
A typhoon hits Kobe, killing hundreds and causing catastrophic mudslides. Those mudslides damaged the building beyond repair. It probably could have been fixed, but the new owners, the cost was just too much. So it's abandoned again. It had a second life, but it was painfully brief.
Those mudslides came inside here. It was such a mess that they couldn't run it as a hotel anymore.
While the site has seen a few other short-lived uses through the years, it would never fully recover from this devastating natural catastrophe. Now being watched over by the Maya Mountain Revitalization Association, the building is about to enter a new phase.
I was born and bred in this city. And this building has always been here. I believe tangible things will eventually return to nature. So, I want to protect them.
In a blustery Scottish estuary, a world-famous structure spans the deep waters.
The first thing you notice is this big, red giant of engineering.
This is a very dangerous place to build a bridge.
It towers over a craggy outcrop.
In the middle of this enormous estuarial river, you find this tiny, rocky island.
There's all sorts of things tucked away around the edges. There's quite a lot going on.
An insignificant structure at the base of the bridge could hold a clue to this small island's importance and its link to a fatal disaster that rocked a nation. This waterway is known as the Firth of Forth.
The size and depth of this estuary made it Scotland's most important trade artery for centuries.
Sitting below the Forth Bridge is the abandoned island of Inchgarvie. Historian Ron Morris has been studying the site for decades.
We're approaching Inchgarvie, and it's about 500 yards long and just maybe 30 yards wide at its widest point. It looks a very small island, but it has a wealth of history attached to it.
Inchgarvie translates as rough Ireland, and this place really lives up to the name. The currents are terrible, the waves crash into it. It's cold, terrifying, and claustrophobic.
Evidence suggests Inchgarvie had been inhabited since the late 1400s.
There's, the early mortar from 500 years ago, and it's still holding good. today.
People have been building here clearly with an eye to defending this bare, rocky island.
In the days when the only way to cross this estuary was by boat, Inchgarvie was an important staging post. In 1491, King James of Scotland granted a local laird the right to build a fort here.
So a castle here, fortified with cannon, could offer a safe anchorage upriver for mercantile traffic.
But Inchgarvie's ruins show that someone has defended the estuary much more recently. Newer fortifications date back to the First World War.
The first thing you notice is a gun emplacement, which is obviously 20th century, and the gun battery faces east, which would be towards the North Sea, towards the entryway to this estuarial river.
Now see, this is the eastmost 4-inch gun position. There should be a ring of bolts in here, but really covered by the vegetation, which was a holdfast for the actual 4-inch quick-firing gun. This was the original living quarters for the original garrison, which was a very small number of men. There was only about 6 or 7 men actually stationed on the island to look after the battery.
Yet the disaster linked to this place came not through war, but in peacetime. 40 years earlier, the advancing age of invention meant that Scotland's Firth of Forth had to be conquered.
The UK was exploding in trade and transportation. The railway boom had kicked off big style, and goods and people were moving all over the UK. But the Firth of Forth, this huge, deep water channel, was an unsurmountable obstruction. To get from one side to the other would be a 40-mile detour or a tricky trip on a ferry.
So they commissioned a bridge, but there was a problem.
The depth of the estuary made it very difficult to build.
The estuary is about a mile wide here. It's where the estuary really narrows, but we have about 30 fathoms of water depth on either side of Inchgarvie.
In the 19th century, Inchgarvie was bought by the Forth Bridge Railway Company to provide a foundation for a bridge.
What you see on the surface is just a tenth of it, but the geology underneath the water means that rocks extend out.
Over millennia, glacier ice scoured away soft layers of rock, leaving behind hard, rocky outcrops like Inchgarvie.
And that provided a solid foundation in order to get the cantilever for the centre of the Firth Bridge.
There was a natural column, a stone foundation, right there in the middle of the Firth of Forth, Inchgarvie. It was like a gift from the gods.
But an abandoned pier points to a complication.
To be quite honest, people are so taken up with the wonder of the Forth Bridge itself that they tend to overlook this.
If you look at the bottom of the bridge, there's like a stump, as if an extra caisson had been built and then discarded.
A caisson is the first step in building a bridge. This watertight structure allows the foundations to be laid.
The geology of the region here makes it very hard to successfully build a bridge. You've got to build caissons, float them to just the right spot, and then sink them deeply onto the sea floor in order to build the footings for your bridge. Here on the island, we can see that somebody has started to put caissons down.
The explanation for the abandoned caisson lies 30 miles north, on another windy Scottish estuary, the Tay. Here, the celebrated engineer Thomas Bouch had built the Tay Bridge.
Sir Thomas Bouch. He designs caissons, the ability to sink a ring into a water body and then put concrete inside it, so you can build up these supports.
His next commission was to design another bridge to span the Firth of Forth.
This brick pier was the first pier that was constructed to hold the first design of the rail bridge. And there was to be 8 of these piers in which the centre of the bridge would be supported. There'd be 2 great spans.
Bouch's new design was hailed as the wonder of the age, until the howling winds of Scotland sent dozens of unfortunate souls into the waters.
One night, the wind got up really quite strong, so a big load from sort of horizontal direction pushing against the Tay Bridge that Sir Thomas Bouch hadn't accounted for.
The central section of the Tay Bridge collapsed.
The train continued to carry on and plunged back into the water.
More than 70 people died in the Tay estuary that night.
This was bad news for the Forth Bridge. The future of that new rail bridge was now in doubt. Could they continue building the bridge using the design of this now disgraced architect, or should they abandon the project? Well, they decided to scrap it.
All you can see now, and what's left behind, is one pillar sticking up out of the sea.
Thomas Bouch was devastated. His reputation was ruined, and he never recovered, and he died in disgrace. A few years later, a new bridge was commissioned, and it still stands to this day.
The Forth Bridge is now one of 3 to span the estuary.
The finished structure was described as the 8th wonder of the world. And if it wasn't for the presence of Inchgarvey, we could never have had the Forth Bridge built.
In the north of the Mediterranean island of Sardinia is the imperious granite massif of Monte Limbara.
You ascend up this winding, steep mountain road until you reach the peak. And then in a clearing, these 6 massive structures appear out of nowhere.
All of a sudden you see this compound of massive antennas pointed off in all directions. Some very large and ambitious communications center was built here, but what was it for?
At almost 4,500 feet above sea level, this mountain creates its own microclimate.
This place is at high altitude, and the weather can turn on a knife edge. One minute it's brilliant sunshine, and the next you're enveloped by cloud.
They must have had an excellent reason to want to build this kind of very ambitious high-tech facility in exactly this spot.
Inside you have row upon row of electronics equipment, massive generators, living quarters, and of course these 6 huge dishes. Whoever built this had access to some serious resources.
Kept top secret for decades, speculation over the type of operations that took place here has always been rife, and rumors still abound.
The locals have no details, so the locals make up their own stories to explain this mysterious, hulking presence on top of the mountain.
Marcello Moretto remembers well what this site looked like years ago.
It is rather weird to see it today, but at the time it was abandoned. It was left in perfect working condition, even though, of course, it was no longer in use.
He works for an environmental agency, now trying to clean up the noxious mess left by this decaying infrastructure.
From an environmental standpoint, especially from a forestry standpoint, this is a dump of basically iron materials.
This is built at the top of a mountain. Everything that happens up here flows downstream. And as this place starts to disintegrate, it becomes a toxic threat to people living down below.
The long-term environmental impact was the last thing on the minds of those constructing this complex back in 1966, when the world was split by two bitterly opposed ideologies.
It is no exaggeration to say that this is a moment when the NATO countries, the United States and its European allies, are convinced that any moment the Soviets are going to attack. This place is born out of a very real expectation that the Cold War is going to turn into World War III any day.
Both sides knew they needed excellent communications, both to know what was happening, but also potentially to prevent a misfire, to prevent a false alarm.
These 6 vast dishes date back to that time. Inside, rusting machinery reveals the identity of their owners. Built by the US Air Force, this was one of NATO's most secret radio communication centers. The Monte Limbara station was designed to plug a weak spot in NATO defenses.
NATO's southern flank, that is the NATO countries facing south towards North Africa, was always the soft underbelly of NATO. It was always a place where the Soviets or their allies might be able to strike.
The location of this facility reveals NATO's clandestine intention.
The island of Sardinia is beautifully placed for this kind of communication. For one thing, you're sitting in the Mediterranean between Italy and Spain. To the east, it points to a similar station in Naples, to the west, to the island of Minorca off the coast of Spain, and via those, ultimately, around the world.
This station was part of a vast network, capable of transmitting crucial classified messages over thousands of miles. Until the 1950s, radio communication beyond the curvature of the Earth, which blocked the signal, was impossible. The ultra-high frequency devices and abandoned technology found here show how this was overcome.
This was a microwave communications base that used microwaves to communicate by using the troposphere, part of the atmosphere, to send microwaves over the horizon. And the best way to communicate long distances at this time was called troposcatter, or tropospheric scatter.
With the invention of troposcatter, stations like Monte Limbara could transmit to a receiver station out of the line of sight by using particles 6 miles up in the Earth's lower atmosphere to reflect microwave signals.
That system can amplify the signal, send it up again, and repeat the process. So instead of sending your radio signal, 30, 40, 50 miles, now you can send it 250 miles.
That meant fewer costly relay stations and much faster long-distance communication.
We were ready to coordinate the nuclear forces that were going to have to smash a Soviet advance into Western Europe. The amount of communication and coordination that was required by the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, by NATO, by the vast American commitment to defending Europe, all of that required an immense amount of coordination.
Thankfully, they never had to, but the fact that we were ready maybe is part of the reason, on both sides, why the Cold War never turned hot.
Yet legend has it, this base did play an active role in war. A US fighter bomber was supposedly guided by Monte Limbara antennae on a controversial mission.
In 1986, a disco in Berlin is bombed by Libyan-sponsored terrorists, and American servicemen are involved. President Reagan orders Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator, that his family compound be bombed by American aircraft.
Gaddafi's private residence was struck, and dozens of civilians were also killed. The claim that the station facilitated the strike, however, remains unproven. Even as the Iron Curtain was lifting across Europe, it hadn't yet outlived its usefulness.
As late as the first Gulf War in 1991, this system was still very much in use and useful during that period when all kinds of secure traffic had to travel around the Mediterranean and Europe.
The Monte Limbara station was finally retired in 1993.
It had been made obsolete by satellite communications, which communicate with any point on the planet.
When the US forces left, it was like they just vanished into thin air. But what they left behind wasn't just documents, machinery, and equipment. It was an ecological nightmare.
For the locals, there was one final insult.
There's this revelation of exactly how much the US paid the Italian government for use of this mountaintop site for 27 years. Just 5 lira a year.
That's less than $1. Environmentalists like Marcello Moretto are attempting to clean up Monte Limbara and transform it into a place of historical significance.
We would like this place to become a museum about the Cold War, a museum of industrial and military archaeology. It would have its own importance.
In a more recent turn of events, tropospheric scattering is experiencing a resurgence, and military experts see renewed potential for sites like this.
As NATO weakens in the face of American disinterest, as Russia becomes more powerful, it is not difficult to see a scenario in which someone desiring to dominate the Mediterranean could deploy anti-satellite weapons and could create a situation in which this mountaintop might again be useful as a communication station.